do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Incident?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
implications
of a community.
before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Our next guest believes the planet faces no greater challenge than figuring out how to eliminate nuclear weapons. We talked with Ambassador Richard Butler, one of the world's leading experts with respect to nuclear arms control and disarmament. Ambassador Butler is the former executive chairman of the United Nations Special Commission to Disarm Iraq. He has served as Australian ambassador to the United Nations and chairman of the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Currently, he is Distinguished Scholar for International Peace and Security at the Penn State School of International Affairs. Ambassador Butler talked with us about the elimination of nuclear weapons, renewing U.S. foreign policy, and reforming the UN Security Council. Ambassador Butler joined us in our University Park campus studio. We welcome Richard Butler to the conversation. You have spent much of your career, more than 3.5 decades, working to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. How would you characterize the nuclear threat today as compared with the beginning of the nuclear age in 1945?
It's more significant today because the structure of it has changed completely. In 1945, after the United States detonated 3 nuclear weapons, the test one in New Mexico and then over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States offered to the Russians the prospect of internationalizing all of this and stopping the threat. Albert Einstein wrote to the president, an old friend of mine, Sir Joseph Rotblat, who was just then a young Polish refugee scientist, also did the same. There was an immediate recognition after the events over Japan that this could go well out of control and we should do something about it. Stalin rejected it, and then that started, Patty, a period of 40 years, actually 45 years, 4.5 decades of desperate competition in nuclear weapons, which led to this. Listen to me, it's incredible. 3 weapons in 1945. In 1985, there were 80,000, each of them much more powerful than those that were used over Japan. So how I would characterize it is that it spun out of control. But we started to bring that back only to face the new situation. India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, possibly Iran, possibly terrorist acquisition of nuclear weapons. I think today's situation is actually possibly the critical one that we have ever faced.
You mentioned 80,000 nuclear weapons
Yes.
by 1985,
Yes,
1990.
that's right.
The number has gone down to something in the neighborhood of 27,000 nuclear weapons
Right.
today. But give us an idea of how, in terms of its destructive power, how it would compare with Hiroshima.
What exists today and is on high alert is 100,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. Simple. It's off the wall and spinning a little bit out of control because of the newly emerged nuclear weapon states and the wannabes, the ones who want to be. So although we had a terrible problem during the Cold War, and I'm not suggesting that it's all been completely under control, I think we're at a critical point because we're at a point where the possession of nuclear weapons is starting to expand. And I think that's truly serious.
In terms of ownership, manufacture, it's going up again.
Yes, not greatly, but inexorably. That is, inevitably going up. And the reason for that is that the 2 big countries who have the most of them, while they have reduced, haven't kept their promise, which they made, decades ago, actually.
Back in 1969.
Well, 68 was that's right, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They've not kept their promise to progressively get rid of these weapons, and that has meant that others who want to get them can say, well, if it's good enough for your security, why isn't it good enough for ours? And so the the trend is upwards in a way that I think is truly dangerous.
In fact, you say that your biggest fear is that we will have to endure some kind of a catastrophe before the world is on board in enforcing the elimination of nuclear weapons. Give us what you think is a possible scenario.
I'm so glad you mentioned that concept, and I would love to share it with you and people who may be watching this program. It's what, in one of the books I've written, I call the catastrophe theory of historical change. And let's bring it right back to ordinary circumstances that exist in all our communities. You're living in a village or a town. A train goes through that town each day, but there's no gates. You have to, level crossing, as we call it in Australia. So you have to wait, hear a bell ring or whatever, and the citizens keep saying to the local council, we need gates to come down when the train is coming so no one gets killed. And because people have got other priorities or political manipulation or whatever, it doesn't happen. One day, a little kid walks across that track at the time the train is coming. Bang, dead. Next day, there are gates. And we have a level crossing. Did we have to await the death of that child to do what we knew for a long time was the truth? That's the catastrophe theory of change. In the nuclear field, I say the same. We know exactly what nuclear weapons are. We know how utterly devastating they are, how any use of them would be unconscionable. But we've continually stalled, like the gates at the level crossing. We have continually stalled, in doing anything about it. And I think the time has come for us to stop that. Patty, one of the problems we've had in the nuclear age is that people have tried to say that nuclear weapons aren't so bad, they're just a bigger pop gun. I'm here to tell you they are not. They are not just a bigger pop gun. They are qualitatively different because of the radiation they produce, because of the extent of the damage they produce, and because it takes years for any agriculture or community to recover. Do you know that there's a very creditable study out now that shows that if India and Pakistan, who have both become nuclear weapon states, were to exchange only 4 nuclear weapons, Pakistan fires one at India, India retaliates, another one, and then they cry uncle because they can see how many millions are dead, right? What would then happen? Nothing would grow in the soil of central India and Pakistan for 5 years. So the blast and other damage from the weapons would be one thing, but people, millions, would starve. This is what nuclear weapons are. They're not a bigger pop gun. They're qualitatively different.
A colleague of yours, Ambassador Thomas Graham, says that one reason for the seeming lack of public support for disarming is that arms control, non-proliferation, and international law seem complicated, technical, difficult to understand, and removed from everyday life. And I think you both agree that the public is confused about the issues, as you've just illustrated.
Tom Graham is an old friend of mine, a distinguished American ambassador in the field of arms control. I love him dearly, and he's a brilliant man. I agree with most of what he said, but on one of the points here, I don't agree. Not because I think he's wrong, but because maybe when he made those remarks, we didn't have this information at our disposal. Public opinion surveys have now been conducted. When asked the simple question about nuclear weapons disarmament or continue to rely on them, about 70% of people say it would be best if they disappeared. The same figure in Russia is about 65%. So the public, as sometimes happens, in fact, I think fairly often happens, the public is in fact in front of the politicians. The politicians are frightened. They don't want to risk getting re-elected by going out on a limb on something like nuclear weapons or green environment and so on. And sometimes, and more often than not these days, they're wrong. The general public get it.
The U.S. Senate failed to ratify the treaty in 1999,
The
and
Test Ban
Obama,
Treaty.
the Dispan Treaty, the Test Ban Treaty, and Obama said if he became president, that's something that he would work on as soon as was practical.
Well, of course he will. And I'm intimately aware of the Test Ban Treaty because I'm not boasting, but I am actually the person who tabled it in the General Assembly of the United Nations and worked it for weeks with every delegation and so on, and got it adopted by 154 votes to 4. The Clinton administration took it to the Senate and lost ratification of it by a few votes. Dreadfully sad and wrong. Now, in the meantime, the United States has stopped nuclear testing. Most others have. But we do need this instrument, and I'm quite confident that President Obama will resubmit it to the Senate, and reasonably confident that with a few Republicans crossing the floor, that we'll get it ratified. That's something that would send a signal to the world of great importance on two fronts. One, that the US is back in the business of trying to get this nuclear weapons tiger by the tail, and two, that this administration can produce results, that the US is going to be a cooperative country with others, and I'm hopeful that it will happen.
And in fact, you say that for this to be successful, the United States has to lead the way.
Well, it does up to a point. Let me put it the other way around. If the United States is not on board with any of these actions, then their prospects of success, will be reduced. One of the things I've argued here at Penn State University, however, is that the idea that nothing can happen unless the US authorizes it is old-fashioned. The world has become much more globalized, much more cooperative. What I've argued strongly here is that the best possible United States, a country of extraordinary power and influence, and justifiably so, something with which I agree, but the best possible role it can play is one of cooperation, which is a little different from leading. Leading can very quickly lead to telling people what to do. Cooperation means that you sit down and hear their problems, you work with them, you find a common solution, and as powerful as the US is, you then lead in the implementation of that solution. But you don't dictate to people what is right think or wrong think. You sit and talk with people. And I think the prospects under the new administration for that kind of cooperative behaviour have greatly improved.
95% of the nuclear weapons that you mentioned a moment ago are in the hands of the Russian Federation and the United States. Talk a little bit, if you would, about what it means that a certain percentage of them are on high alert. So if the order is made that we're going to use a nuclear weapon, what happens? How quickly does it happen?
Well, under the existing START 1 treaty, which runs out at the end of this year, and Obama has already indicated, President Obama, that he will seek to renegotiate that with the Russians, and I think the Russians are going to agree. That treaty sets the limits on the number of systems, missile systems, that each side can have on high alert. And it's about 1,500 to 1,700 apiece. Now, behind that is a lot of other nuclear weapons in storage, adding up to the 27,000 figure, of which they together hold 95%. Now, come to your point, and I thank you for raising the point, because if I were able, through you, to convey anything to people, it's this one. 1,500 to 1,700 systems, missiles, on either side, on high alert, means this, okay? If the radar screens tell you that the other side is starting to prepare, fueling their missiles or ready to prepare, it's called launch on warning, they're about to fire, then the guys sitting in the silos in Omaha have about 2 to 3 minutes to communicate that to Washington. The President of the United States has 4 to 5 minutes to decide what to do about it. And if those missiles are fired, they have a flight time of 30 to 40 minutes.
From the U.S. to
or
Russia?
either way, okay?
30 minutes.
So for the time in which you and I will have this interview, let's say we go back to the moment we started. If an order had been given in Moscow or St. Petersburg to fire, by the time we finish this interview, unless some intervention took place, for which the President and others have only a few minutes, 5, by the time we finish this interview, we're dead. Now, the question is why? What purpose does that serve? I beg you, why? Maybe in the past, in the Cold War, it had some purpose, but today, Cold War was finished 20 years ago. Why, in the name of God, are we in that situation? I know some of the young men and women who sat there out in Omaha looking at those screens, and it really makes them crazy to think that a red light will flash and they have to start the procedure to do this. Why? Why? Now, a key answer to that, Patty, is really simple. Before we even get into the tougher business of getting rid of those missiles, disarmament on both sides, a key answer is this: take them off alert.
And in fact,
just switch it off, so that instead of 5 minutes to argue about it, you've got 5 hours. And that difference may sound small, but given the power of those weapons, it is infinity.
in fact, in a report, a 1996 report that you were a part of, the Canberra Commission,
I was chairman of it, yeah.
Came up with a report that says that that's one of the things that must be done. They must be taken offline, off high alert.
Well, thank you for mentioning that report. It's 12 years old now, called the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, and it's still highly regarded as one of the best that's ever been done. But I'm pleased to tell you that there are dozens of them now. The Global Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction, the Stimson Report, the Carnegie Corporation Report. Everyone knows. Patty, I want to emphasise this to you. It's like going into a restaurant with a big smorgasbord table, right? On this table is laid out all the things we need to do about nuclear weapons.
So we know.
A test ban treaty. Take them off alert. Stop making material for weapons-grade material. We say that to Iran. You can make electricity, but not weapons-grade material, and so on and so forth. We know the smorgasbord is there, from nuts to dessert. We know exactly what we need to do to bring the nuclear horror under control. There's no lack of knowledge. What there has been is a lack of political will, not on the part of bureaucrats, intellectuals, people like me, whatever I am, not on the part of those, but on the part of politicians to step up to this and declare nuclear deterrence empty and horrible. That the
mutual
Cold
destruction
War,
as well.
Yeah, I mean, imagine running the railroad on the basis of mutual assured destruction. We're living our life happily today on the basis of a thing called mutual assured destruction. What a joke. What a joke. So, we need politicians to have the guts to say to those who elected them, you know what? We'll fix the town water supply. We'll work on trade. We'll try and get, better banking rules and all the things that affect ordinary people. But on the way along that road, let me tell you this. If you elect me, what you will get is complete resistance to this total nonsense that has threatened us for so long, called nuclear weapons. We will take them off alert. We will stop making material for bombs. We will insist that other countries with whom we deal do the same, or we won't deal with them. We will remove from this earth these weapons which can uniquely destroy the whole earth. Rifles and handguns don't do that, much as I have a problem with those, but they don't destroy the whole earth.
I think one of the most important things I've read from you is this axiom of proliferation. As long as one country has them, other countries will seek them.
What an extraordinary person you are. No, I mean, you've done all the research, and not because you've found things I've written, but you've put your finger on something that is utterly central. You think about it. the axiom of proliferation, which was designed by the Canberra Commission, the one that you mentioned, of which I was chair, and had 2 Nobel Prize winners on it, you know. The axiom of proliferation says, quite simply, and ordinary people can understand this, and going back to an earlier question of yours, or, you know, you raised the issue that this is too complicated for ordinary people to understand. It absolutely is not. Okay? The axiom of proliferation says, as long as any country has nuclear weapons, others will seek to get them. And now today, those others includes not just countries, but non-state groups like terrorist groups. And what that essentially asserts is something that I truly believe to be the case, which is that human beings will not accept unfairness. I tell my students at NYU and at Penn State that I hate human nature arguments. So often people say, oh, it's human nature to have a gun. It's human nature, you know, my wife works in the area of HIV, AIDS and sex work, and she's confronted all the time with people saying, it's human nature for men to buy sex from prostitutes. You know, I don't accept that, but it is human nature to be greedy, and it is human nature to absolutely refuse to accept unfairness.
And so what does that mean?
There's a great philosopher at Harvard, he died last year, called John Rawls, who wrote a fabulous book on justice. And he said, justice is defined as fairness. You cannot say to a person that this is good for me, but it's not for you. And in my field, the nuclear business, you cannot say to a country, our security is so important that we have to have these weapons that will destroy the whole world, but yours is not. As long as one country has them, others will seek to acquire them, and they will because they will say, it's not fair. It's not fair that you can have them, but we can't.
Food security is a growing problem. The need for energy is a growing problem. Climate change is a growing problem.
Water.
And I'm wondering to what
Soon
extent
we'll face inadequate water supplies in the world.
So all of these things are converging at the same time, as you say, in many ways the numbers of countries who want to own nuclear weapons is increasing. That would seem to me to increase the threat.
No, I welcome the question. I'll tell you why. It is a question of priorities in today's globalized world and today's climate-threatened world. And I guess my basic argument is and will be this. Let's take off the table this monstrous nonsense of the death machine, the thing through which we can destroy everything, nuclear weapons. They may briefly have had a purpose during the Cold War, but they have no further purpose now. Let's take them off the table. They cost trillions of dollars to maintain, by the way. That would release a lot of money for other purposes. Because, you see, our agenda is so vexed, whether it's climate change, diminishing food supplies. There are places in the world, Patty, that are going to run out of water. You ask yourself, how easy will it for people, how will it be for people to start to kill each other for water? Piece of cake. They'll do that readily. And they'll feel no need to explain to anyone, I shot that person because there was a puddle of water that he wanted and I wanted. You know, these things are very serious. Then there's employment. There's reconstructing the global economy, which has been so trashed by simple greed and not sharing. Now, with problems like that on our plate, but let's not go further than what's happening to the climate and what's happening to the world's climatic system in terms of its outcomes for whole countries disappearing underwater and not being able to grow crops in other countries and so on. This is a very serious matter. Why, in the name of God, should we be spending time with these dinosaurs whose day has gone, called nuclear weapons? instead of addressing those serious problems.
I want to talk with you in a moment about what fresh ideas you might bring to the table to eliminate nuclear weapons. But you've mentioned a couple of times talks you'll be giving at Penn State, talks you've given at New York University, and I wanted to read part of your resume and then find out what brings you here. You're the former executive chairman of the UN Special Commission to Disarm Iraq. You're the chief inspector of Iraq between 1997 and 99. You served as Australian ambassador to the UN, the chairman, as we mentioned a moment ago, to the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, Australian ambassador for disarmament, Australian ambassador to Thailand and Cambodia, and there's much, much more. Now, today, you're a distinguished scholar of international peace and security at Penn State's New School of International Affairs. Explain how your career path led you here, and what can you do in this capacity that you couldn't do in diplomatic service, for example?
On your last question, it's easy. I do not have to take instructions from any government. I'm a free man. And it feels great, okay? Look, I had a wonderful career in official service. I'm not trying to correct your resume that you kindly summarised, but it also included in Australian domestic political service. I was Chief of Staff of our White House. So I've had domestic political experience, international political experience, and in the latter, I was given some of the most important jobs in the world. At the time that Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, asked me to leave my government service and come to the UN and be in charge of the disarmament of Iraq, it was then one of the truly important jobs. And so I went to do it, not because it was important, but because my whole shtick is arms control. I just don't believe that weapons really answer anyone's problems. I've had a fantastic career as an official, a diplomat, say, Chief of Staff of the White House, foreign policy maker, and all of those things. And I learnt a lot. I learnt a great deal about how world politics works. I know many of the significant personalities involved over the years, including some who are still there. The Foreign Minister of Russia today, Sergei Lavrov, and I were colleagues at the UN for, 15, 20 years. I've known Sergei for years.
And of course, Hillary Clinton is talking with him now, which is good news.
Yeah, and that's good. I know Hillary Clinton, worked with her husband for a while. When he was president, I was in charge of the Iraq thing. I learnt a lot and had some wonderfully fascinating experiences, but, the clock ticks on, and I've become of a certain age, so I stopped doing that. So what to do? Nothing? No. I actually thought, I don't want to work as hard as I did then, not that many hours, which was sort of 23 hours a day, but I just was struck by the idea that I may have learnt something that could be useful. But, I just thought, wow, absolutely, what a good thing to do, to share my experience with younger people, as I say again for the third time, to be freed of the strictures of government instructions, to just lay on the table, I think, the things that I've learned, the things I think are true, and I think that's a pretty good way to try to make a different world.
Is it heartening that there are peace studies and international groups like the one you're affiliated with here at Penn State literally popping up in university communities all around the world?
It is. When I was an official, I had difficulty with the notion of peace studies. It sounded to me like St. Augustine saying, seek good and avoid evil, but the question is, great, yes, shall we all seek good and avoid evil? The question is, how? On what subjects? On what matters? What constitutes good? What constitutes evil? And you have to quickly recognise that what is good for one person is evil for the other. So you can't avoid negotiating differences. But yes, I think in contrast to that, I have to say this. I think, and if you'll forgive me for a moment, this is almost a philosophic indulgence, but I'll keep it brief. I'm old enough and experienced enough to say this. I think that something terrible has happened in our world since the First and Second World Wars, and then backed up by the Cold War. Truly, Patty, we committed such violence in the 20th century, 100 million dead in 2 wars, and then the atomic bombs, that I think we've made people deeply cynical about being a human being and how we conduct our human affairs. And I think that's tragic. I think it's frightening and tragic. And it's one of the reasons why you get shootings in high schools and so on. I mean, you can't watch that stuff on videos and video games without becoming inured, accustomed to violence. I think we've got an enormous task on our hands. It has to do with the role of violence in society, the salience of weapons. Too many people think weapons will fix your problem. They exacerbate the problem. And so, yeah, I'm on a bit of a mission within my own spirit. In that sense, I think that if I can make even a drop in the bucket, a minor contribution to turning around this profound cynicism that has washed through our society in the post-atomic age, then I'd be making a good contribution.
You talk a lot on the Penn State campus and elsewhere about renewing U.S. foreign policy, and you've made mention of the Cold War and the way America was post-World War II and the way America is today. Talk a little bit about what's needed to change the United States standing in the world and to make the difference that you're yearning for.
2 things. One, first of all, stop the rubbish that says we won the Cold War. We didn't. The Russians lost it.
And there's a difference.
Absolutely crucial difference. If you say we won the Cold War, as all the neoconservatives have, then you say our big weapons, our threat of Star Wars, our muscularity, even our testicularity, you know, this makes us the 100-pound, 600-pound gorilla on the block. Everyone runs away. We are the toughest around. That's what it meant. We won the Cold War. And the neocons then went on to say that means that we don't have to obey any international laws. They really did. I mean, they said in public, international law doesn't apply to the United States.
In fact, John Bolton said that to you once.
Yes, that's right.
International law doesn't
There's
matter.
no such thing.
National
John
sovereignty
Bolton said to me,
matters.
there's no such thing as international law. There's only national sovereignty. That is nonsense. It's factually, when I'm saying nonsense, is that an emotional thing? No. It is factually incorrect. There is such a thing as international law. The United States is party to most of the international law treaties. To suggest that the United States can exempt itself from these things, whereas the Geneva Conventions and then set up Guantanamo and torture people and all that stuff, it is a travesty. It has done profound harm to the United States. The United States has to stop that nonsense, and I think under Obama it's already started to do so, stop the nonsense of American exceptionalism. Secondly, and this is much more, that's negative. The US has to get that stuff out of its system. And it's based on a fallacy. The US did not win the Cold War. The Russians internally collapsed and lost it. And that's a crucial difference. Now, to be more positive, the US can come to understand that the greatness of a great power resides actually not in muscularity, but in generosity. The US is immensely powerful and great in its ideas and in its economy, but I suspect most of all in its ideas. There are so many places in the world, and I've visited 100 countries. There are so many places in the world that don't remotely know what it feels like to live in the sort of domestic tranquility, to use the words of the great American Declaration, or liberality, freedom. The word freedom is hard to use today because George W. Bush so misused it. But still, there is such a thing. So many parts of the world don't have any understanding, no experience of what we enjoy daily here. And you can draw two conclusions from that. You can go back to saying that makes us superior, or you can say that should enjoin us to be gracious. Grace in great power is much better than arrogance. Grace means that the great power continues to succeed because it spreads around it cooperation. And you know, the history of the world includes the history of great powers failing through arrogance. This country is great, and true greatness consists of graciousness, cooperation with others.
And in fact, I think Roosevelt said that as he left office, and I think Obama
But
paraphrased that in his inauguration
I've been
speech.
through all of that in preparing my lecture on renewing American foreign policy, and of course Roosevelt did. But so did Eisenhower, which I find fascinating because I'm not a Republican. Well, I'm not either because I'm a permanent resident of the United States, but I'm not a member of any political party here. But my inclination would not be towards the Republicans. But here was a five-star general, probably the great general of the 20th century, who led the victory in Europe against the Nazis, who was a Republican, became a Republican president, and I urge people, read Eisenhower's farewell speech. And he says all of these things. Now, 50, 60 years later, there's Obama in his inaugural address saying, we cannot do this by military muscle alone. What is our strength is our values, our humility, our willingness to cooperate with others. You know, I'm not a fan of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Karl Rove and all those people. Kell's surprise, right? You wouldn't have thought that. But, you know, their legacy might be, and I hate the idea of George W. Bush having a historic legacy. I think that's an oxymoron. But their legacy may well be that it's not what they intended, but through their behaviour, they may have given a shot in the arm to a return to American decency and cooperativeness and humanity.
Australians at one time criticized you for being too much a part of the Bush administration, or going along.
Well, some
and Americans,
did.
I'm saying some, and then
yeah.
and some Americans said criticized you for parting with the Bush administration. I was wondering how you kind of reconciled almost two constituencies in a way.
There's nothing to reconcile.
Okay.
In politics, people put forward the view that suits them. The CIA asked me to do some things in Iraq that I refused to do. I can now talk about that. That's a few years ago. And, you know, I'm sure I've got a fat CIA file and so on, and they got very angry with me. And I refused to do it because it wasn't within the strict arms control mandate. It was to advance US interests through a UN organisation. And I refused. They got very cross with me. On the other hand, one of my critics for that period has argued that my main problem was that I got too thoroughly into bed with the CIA. So he should go talk with the CIA, who have this fat file and were unhappy, and he thought I was too much in bed with them, you know. And there are, you know, there's a percentage of Australians who are knee-jerk anti-American, and because I agreed with some of the things that America was doing, they said, he's sold out, he's crossed to the other side. You know, I would waste our time to go on and on about this. I'll go back to my original point. People have their political point of view. That's fine in a democracy. People often dignify their point of view by saying it's not just a point of view, but it's a point of principle, and there's been a betrayal here, that this guy crossed to the other side and all that. Because people say those things, it's not necessarily true.
Which will get me to the media, but I said we'd talk about generosity for a minute, so I'd like to do that. The United States gives, I think, 0.2% of its GDP
That's
to foreign aid.
Yeah, yet it's pledged under the UN to give 0.07%.
Right, and we don't. And you say we would go a long way if we would fulfill that commitment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole debate taking place about how effective foreign aid is and what difference would it make, in fact, to people on the ground. I can't answer that, but in my first Penn State lecture on US foreign policy, I said that it is beyond doubt that if the US were to move from what seems like a very niggardly and mean 0.2% to 0.7%, which would be the cost of a couple of jet fighters, I mean, it would be lunch money, really, to do that. It would send an incredibly important political signal to the world that the US was back as a cooperative citizen. How the money's used, would it help developing countries adequately, is a whole other issue. You know, among other things, I'm an economist, and, you know, I still can't get my head around exactly how foreign aid works. Does it do well or not well? There are some places where it does, others where it doesn't. And I am not expert enough to know whether or not foreign aid, you know, how good or bad it is. I've been in, as I say, 100 countries, and I've seen some appalling situations that could be fixed with a few dollars. But the point I was making in my Penn State speech was that it is unrespectable, no matter what the financial crisis, it's unrespectable for a country as awash in money as this country is to be so mean about the number of dollars that it gives to developing countries. And if it were to change that and simply meet the UN target, the kudos that would come to the United States.
Does the economic
would be
downturn
fantastic.
change any of that?
No, it's lunch money. In comparison with a few $100 million more to the developing countries from a country that is so wealthy, although in great difficulty now. But if, as a political advisor, going back to my time in the Australian White House and so on, I would say to the Prime Minister, piece of cake. Piece of cake. Give them this extra money, which represents a few lunches, you know, that could mean the world to them. We don't know exactly how that will work. We'd like to think it would. But let's get that out of our budget, and the Prime Minister would say, yeah, but we've got real problems. We've got rising unemployment and this and that. Forget it. It's a small amount of none. The disappearance of that amount of money isn't going to change our economic circumstances. It might change those in the developing countries. But above all, it will change our political circumstances. It will show the world that we're back on deck as a serious participant in the world's problems, that this richest of all countries isn't behaving like Scrooge. That's what we've done here. Behave like Scrooge and say, we can't afford to give what is the cost of a few jet fighters to the developing world. Unbelievable. And we'd do ourselves a big favour politically if we got that criticism off the books. That's what I'm saying.
You've said on one hand that the U.S. press, freedom of press is greater here than any place else, and yet that doesn't mean that the information that's disseminated to the public is always good information. So I'd like really your critique of the media and its role in our understanding of lack of understanding of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time in my life dealing with the press on both sides of the camera, you know, the victim and the perpetrator. You know, I mean, and what am I now? I'm the victim, right? You're the perpetrator. But, you know, I've done a lot of that, and in print and so on. It's really odd, you know. I'm deeply aware, as a person steeped in political philosophy, of how fundamentally important it is to freedom in a society to have freedom of expression. And I've certainly lived in countries where there isn't any. And yeah, I mean, the freedom of expression is truly important. And as far as the world's situations are concerned, you know, I think there's a very high degree of freedom of expression in the United States, probably more so than in most places. The thing you're not to do in the American media is criticise the nation or the presidency. That's why we had 3 years after the illegal invasion by us of Iraq, in which no one would criticise the White House. Yet I know from the inside that everyone in the media knew what a stitch-up it had been, that information that was not true had been used to justify this invasion. But you criticised the government at your peril. freedom of expression is critical to a free society. The problem I have in the United States is with the First Amendment. The First Amendment has provided a license to people to do the most horrendous things, and when you seek to clamp down on them because they've been libelous or defamatory or pornographic or whatever, they say this is freedom of expression. We pay a terrible price in America for the First Amendment. The First Amendment, I think, is that there shall be freedom of expression, right? That's the First Amendment, that everything, there shall be freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and so on. Absolutely supportable. But the use to which
The abuse of it.
so many people have put it to protect things that are clearly have nothing to do with freedom of expression. They have everything to do with making money by selling people pornography, libel, slander. I mean, I won't get myself in court about this, but there are 2 or 3 newspapers that you can get at the supermarket checkout, whose names shall remain nameless, who routinely put fabricated photographs on the front page, who talk about people. I think I saw a headline once years ago that said, "None gives birth to live sheep."
With impunity, because who has deep enough pockets to sue them?
Well, those newspapers, they have a spike like this with all the libel suits. They just put them on the spike, knowing that no one will have the time or money to pursue them. And then if that were to happen, they'll say, but we were just exercising our First Amendment rights to publish what we thought was true or interesting. Patty, I don't know the solution to this. I hate the idea that we'd have boards of censorship, because that's a slippery slope towards fascism. You know, Rush Limbaugh would love it. Okay? So we have to be very careful about that. On the other hand, it is true that the right to freedom of expression in this great country has been routinely and consistently abused. And I frankly do not know what the solution is. To be optimistic, perhaps the solution lies in the good sense of the American people.
Don't buy it.
To pick up one paper and say, well, that's trash, and another one and say, that's okay.
Well, let's get back to the solution to nuclear weapons. The 5 nuclear weapon states, the United States, Russia, France, China, and Britain, and then the newer states.
They're formal.
India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and possibly down the road, Iran. What are the first steps to eliminating nuclear weapons?
The United States and Russia must start in the next few months a conversation to bring about cutting in half their allowable nuclear missile systems from the 1,500 or so down to 1,000 or 800. They must do that because the agreement under which they are at 1,500 will itself run out on the 31st of December this year. That's the Start One agreement. I truly believe that President Obama will promote this, and there are signs from Russia that they might cooperate. Well, that would be the first thing, to reach that agreement and say to the world, we've caught up the lost 8 years. We've come down from 1,500 to 700 or 800, and by that means the world would be intrinsically safer. Secondly, they must make a major effort to ratify the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty so that no one ever again conducts nuclear tests. Thirdly, they must negotiate to conclusion what is called the Fissile Material Cut-Off Treaty. Cut-off means that no one should ever again make weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. For electricity, sure, but not for weapons. Then they should turn to the other outlying 4 nuclear weapon states and say, see, we've made real progress. Now we want to create an international conference where we all sit at the table and begin to design the ultimate reduction where we come down even further, but then that brings you into it, Britain, France, China, and so on. You will also have to start to come down further. India and Pakistan will be very hard nuts to crack. I could see ways in which that could be done. And the hardest nut of all is Israel. Israel that does enjoy special protections from the United States. But in the end, it would also have to be brought in. But you see, and Patty, this is the key point I'll be making in my speech 2 nights from now at Penn State. None of this will happen unless there are new political arrangements. Do you see what I'm saying? The weapons are shockingly dangerous and expensive. At the moment, some countries think they provide them security. They are tragically wrong, as the India and Pakistan example I use shows. Were they to use any of them, nothing would grow anymore in the earth. I mean, it's nonsense. Now, they all have domestic constituencies to deal with. The ordinary Indian in the bazaar thinks it's great to have nuclear weapons. It's right up there with the popularity of the Indian cricket team. And politicians have a responsibility to address that. They have to say to people, you thought that was good, but where we're going actually is even going to be better. All of that will be very difficult, but it can be done. It can be done, but provided that the United States and Russia show an example, take that lead and start to wind the whole situation down. But I'll come back to my central point now. As a consequence of these actions, new arrangements have to be made for the political management of this world, the world without nuclear weapons. You cannot ask India to give up its nuclear weapons. This is an example.
You want a new council.
You cannot ask India to give up its nuclear weapons if you will then continue to insist that they sit in the B team at the bottom of the council table. You have to have a new council, Security Council, or what I've proposed, a Council on Weapons of Mass Destruction, that actually manages the world without nuclear weapons and has sitting at the table respectfully with equal rights, you know, India, Brazil, Egypt, South Africa. You have to have something. You can't ask people to give this thing up that you yourself, if you're the United States, say is so important to your security and prestige. If you then say, and when you've done that, you still have to sit below the salt. You can't be at the top table with us. I truly believe, Patty, that a critical determinant of this, and I'll be at the Carnegie Conference in Washington next week, which is the world's major non-proliferation conference, arguing just this. Start now. Start now to talk with India, Pakistan, Israel, and others. Start now to design the new post-Cold War political management with them so that they know that as they have to do the hard yards with their own people of giving this stuff up, and they, you know, that they will be able to say, and what we get in return is that we're now in Team A.
I want to end with this. I think of Ted Taylor, the nuclear physicist.
I knew Ted well.
Who helped make bombs.
I think he has died now.
He died in 2004.
But I knew Ted in the past well. What a wonderful man.
And he died really despising all things nuclear, very, very afraid
very
of what he
had
played
done.
a part in creating. And he said sooner or later a terrorist group or a psychotic working alone will build a nuclear device. And he felt that neither governments nor individuals were doing enough to rid the world of nuclear weapons. I'm just wondering, how optimistic are you that this council and this plan that you've dreamed of building and are helping to build comes to fruition?
I always reject the distinction, you know, that dichotomy between optimism, pessimism. I've been around some really hard-nosed politics in my time, not only in the nuclear field. I was part of the Cambodia peace settlement, and dealing with Saddam's boys in Iraq was hardly a picnic, you know. So I don't have starry-eyed optimism in my bag, you know. But I utterly reject pessimism. I do think I do think that we human beings have a gift of intellect, sensibility. I mean that quite carefully, Patty, not sensuality and so on. I'm talking about the sense of the value of things. I think we have brains, I think we have sensibility, and I do think too that some of us have an attraction within us towards what I could call ethics. Not morality, I leave religion out of it, I have my own religion, but you know, ethics, that fairness. And so that brings me out on the side of saying, and maybe it's because I played a lot of rugby or something, that if you try hard, you know, if you put your shoulder to the wheel and you try hard and you're well motivated, you can score those points, you can get there. I reject pessimism. And I reject the starry-eyed optimism that says all you need is goodness in your heart. No. You need goodness in your heart and a big stick in your back pocket. You know, you need both of those things. So, because I think that nuclear weapons have become ludicrous, just ridiculous, but unacceptably dangerous on the one hand. And on the other hand, because I think that human beings are, as I describe them, without being starry-eyed optimist about it, yeah, I think we can get this job done.
Let's hope it happens. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
You too.
Thank you for joining us for our conversation with Ambassador Richard Butler, the Distinguished Scholar for International Peace and Security at Penn State School of International Affairs. If you'd like to hear more from Ambassador Butler on the issue of nuclear disarmament, we included one of his lectures titled The Elimination of Nuclear Weapons on our website at conversations.psu.edu. We look forward to seeing you for our next conversation.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU. A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.